Hi, welcome everyone. Yeah, we have some people online. Hi everyone, welcome to join today's speaker series. Like we don't have to mention too many rules, and as usual, like you can keep your question at the end. We have a Q&A session, and glad we have Marshall today to give a presentation, and Park, you can introduce our speaker today. Go ahead, Park.
Thank you so much, John Tao. It's just a great pleasure to introduce Marshall Matz to our Friedman seminar today, this Wednesday. For all of us here in the room and for the many people who are online and those who are watching it recorded, we are delighted to offer you this treat. Marshall is a key figure in U.S. nutrition policy from the 1970s to the present. He is a peer to many of the people who most influenced me in my early career, and a longtime acquaintance and friend to many of the people who are here in this room, and leaders of the Friedman School and leaders of the Friedman School in the generation just before the current leadership. Marshall started his career in legal services in South Dakota, and focused especially on Native American and Indigenous peoples communities, has had a decades-long interest in education related to that, but is most known for his work in nutrition and federal nutrition policy. During the sort of the fallout from the first White House conference in 1969, when enormous things were happening in federal nutrition policy, Marshall was a key figure in the Senate Special Committee on Select Committee on Nutrition for George McGovern, who was just coming off having run for president unsuccessfully and was still ready to make an important mark on American political history, and did so in part through his influence on nutrition. This work affected the start of the Dietary Guidelines. It affected major federal nutrition assistance programs that help millions of Americans. Marshall is an attorney by training, is currently as chairman of OFW Law in Washington, D.C., where he's been for about 30 years. And before that, had another 10 years in private legal service before that, since leaving public service. And he is originally from Massachusetts, from New England. And so this has been sort of fun to have a bit of a return to home ground. And I hope we give a warm welcome to Marshall Matz.
Thank you. Mark, thank you very much. For me, it is a return to home ground, very much so. I was actually born in Cambridge across the river, but that's a little known secret. Most people think in Washington that I'm from South Dakota, and I'll explain why. It's actually a very logical explanation. I was walking around. Am I not in the right spot? I was walking around downtown this morning and got up early and did some of the historic trail. And I'm thinking to myself, the Friedman School is a part of that. It really is. I mean, I see you as leading we started with the Revolutionary War, and now we're in the middle of the nutrition revolution. And I think Maillet really had a vision for that. Dr. Maillet, as you probably all know, I guess, was president of Tufts when he started the Friedman School. He had this vision. He was a very French gentleman, and he spoke with a heavy French accent. And his dad was also an internationally recognized nutritionist. I remember seeing his painting at, I guess it was the FAO in Rome, or maybe it was the WFP in Rome. But it was an interesting part of history. When the founding fathers started the United States, I know that I didn't expect to start here until this morning's walk. Almost everybody farmed. I mean, that's how we produced our living. And that's how we fed the country. The United States at this point has only 1% of the population that farms. So 1% feeds the entire country and feeds the country by and large with a very safe food supply. And this is interesting, at the lowest cost of any nation in the history of the world. So the reason we have a little extra cash to go to Tufts or to buy your flat screen TV or buy any of these modern trinkets that we all have gotten used to, except me, I'm still pretty old fashioned. It's all because of the low price of food. Now, the problem is that that the war on hunger is not complete. We've become extremely efficient in the production of food. We're not quite where we want to be in terms of getting food to people. There's too many people falling through the gaps, and we certainly aren't where we need to be on making sure it's high quality food and that it's a nutritious diet. Before I get too far into my thoughts, which I never write down ahead of time, by the way, because it just confuses me, I want to give a special shout out to a special guest. And Ron Kleiman, who's here as a buddy of mine, is the head of pediatrics at Mass General for Children and the head of pediatrics at Harvard. But he and I know each other because he chairs the board of directors of the Global Child Nutrition Foundation, which works all over the world to help countries expand school lunch in their individual countries, or expand it, or take them where they need to go. The war on hunger in the United States really started, notwithstanding my reference to early America, and one could argue that that was really part of it, really started in the 60s. In the 1960s, people discovered that, oh my God, there was hunger in the United States. Senator Bobby Kennedy, a name that you might have recalled, originally from Mass, but I think he represented New York, if I'm not mistaken. His brother was president from Massachusetts. Mass has always had a special place in my heart for a lot of political reasons. But Bobby represented New York, but he chaired a series of hearings throughout the South that really put hunger and the face of hunger on TV and brought it home to everybody. In May of '68, there was a very famous CBS documentary, Hunger in America, which put on national TV a documentary that was an hour documentary, so it wasn't just a news program. And it really shocked the conscience of America. And George McGovern, who I worked for, who was Senator George McGovern, please feel free to ask me questions. Most Washingtonians just use too many letters and drop too many names and just assume that the audience knows what we know. But you haven't gone through the same history. I'm a part of the baby boom generation, and you're, I guess, Gen X, if I understand that correctly. But at least that's what my kids tell me. George was so offended by that documentary. He told the story many times of taking that camera into the schools, and it focused on a little boy who couldn't eat. He was just standing in the corner because he didn't have enough money for lunch. And he asked the boy, the cameraman asked the boy, maybe it was Charles Carroll, how do you feel? And he said, I just feel embarrassed because I ain't got no money. And this was in southern Mississippi. So as McGovern tells the story, maybe he was exaggerating a bit, he introduced a resolution in the Senate the very next day to create the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition. Now that was 1968. In 1968, President Nixon is elected, who, except for the fact that he was crazy, was not bad on some issues compared to current reality. He would be a moderate, I guess. But he created the Food and Nutrition Service in 1969. Now, this is the first year he's president. He was elected in '68. He gets sworn in '69. One of his highest priorities was creating the Food and Nutrition Service. And then later in the year, he has the White House Conference on Nutrition. It really refreshed my memory going back on a little history. So Nixon was a very conservative Republican. I'm assuming you might have heard of this guy in Watergate, and he was forced out of office, was not impeached, but he would have been, so he left. Here's what he said. I mean, this is odd. And I used to put these quotes in George McGovern speeches. And then later I became very close with Bob Dole, the head Republican involved in all this. And most of the programs you deal with are McGovern-Dole programs. I mean, as we'll get to. But here's Nixon. It could have been George McGovern. First of all, why we have to eliminate hunger. First of all, there is a moral imperative. And even in purely practical terms, there are compelling considerations requiring this challenge to be met. A child ill-fed is dulled in curiosity, lower in stamina, and distracted from learning. We all know that to be true. I mean, if the child doesn't have breakfast in the morning, that's pretty distracted all day long. And then he goes on to talk about a worker ill-fed is less productive, more absent from work. So he talks about the practical consequences of hunger, which is really sort of extraordinary considering how we think of Nixon back in those years. Based on the White House Conference on Nutrition, there was a war on hunger. And George McGovern and Bob Dole, so they were the senior Democrat and senior Republican, they didn't agree on a lot, but they became good buddies around this issue of hunger. They both were war heroes in World War II. They were both from the Midwest. They both had farming backgrounds. So they actually hit it off once they got past the 72 election. Bob Dole told me on more than one occasion, he thought that McGovern was using the select committee as a platform to get elected. But after Nixon creamed McGovern, the only state he carried was right here in Massachusetts. He realized McGovern was serious about this and became more comfortable lending his name to all of these McGovern initiatives. So I became very close with Bob Dole, and so did McGovern. They took on a whole series of bills to implement the White House Conference on Nutrition, which, as you may all know, your dean, your president of Tufts, Jean Maillet, I love that poster out in the hallway because that is what he thought about nutrition. I took a photo of it because I intend to send it to a bunch of people. He said, nutrition is not a discipline, it's an agenda. That is how he thought about it. He thought about it when he became president of Tufts. I knew him when he was still teaching nutrition at the Harvard School of Public Health. So we go back a bit, and he would have the staff of the select committee come up and speak to his class on the politics of nutrition. So I couldn't have ever gotten into Harvard, but here we were lecturing at Harvard, and I always got a kick out of that. But in any event, the White House Conference really set the agenda. And it was quite a packed-full agenda. At the time, I had no clue. You know, you're a young kid. I had dark curly hair, and McGovern had found me working on an Indian reservation, as Park mentioned. That was my first position. I grew up in Connecticut, went to UConn, and I figured I really wanted to get into a more rural existence. So I thought that would be Maine. I mean, if you're from New England, I mean, Maine is rural. But in the middle of all this, I get a call from the president or the director, I guess, of South Dakota Legal Services, who then goes on to become the Republican governor of South Dakota. But at that time, he just said, hey, I've got some people out here working for me, and they won't stay because there's nothing here. I said, well, that sounds perfect. So I packed my car and drove from Connecticut, New Haven to an Indian reservation in South Dakota. That was 1971. 72, McGovern's the nominee. I'd never heard of him, but he was the homegrown boy and, of course, the favorite son. And I got caught up into it because I was living there. And in 73, after he got creamed, he said, how'd you like to come work in Washington? I'm thinking, well, I really don't have a desire to go back to Washington because I just left the East Coast. But I was convinced, try it, you'll like it. And of course I did. I loved it. I loved the challenge, the imagination. I find the legislative process to be really an imaginative process. I mean, there are no rules. It's not like federal court or state court or civil lawsuits or criminal lawsuits. It is subject to your imagination. And we fully exercised that license. We created WIC. You probably have heard about that program, I assume. And WIC, not one, this was before the Budget Act, before the Congressional Budget Office was created, and not one senator asked, how much would it cost? They just thought, yeah, feeding people is a good idea. Hubert Humphrey was the guy that authored it, and with McGovern and Dole, and nobody questioned it. And then a very funny story, later in the 70s, Congress did enact a Budget Act, and they did create a Congressional Budget Office. And so the rules are starting to kick in. Jimmy Carter gets elected in 76, and CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, and OMB, the gatekeepers in the administration, as Eileen knows, OMB recommends that Carter veto the expansion of WIC. And it was a massive expansion from $250 million to $800 million. So I was even more excitable back then than I am now. And I run into McGovern's office. I said, to Senator, they later became first name friends, but back then they were the senators, that's for sure. I said, Senator, I'm told by our friends at USDA that OMB has told Carter to veto the program. McGovern is a laid back way. He's such a laid back guy. Says, well, let's see. So he just hits 0 on his phone and says, this is George McGovern, and I'd like to talk to the vice president. Vice president was Fritz Mondale, the other senator from Minnesota. So there was Humphrey and Mondale from Minnesota. And I could only hear one side. There were no speakerphones. And I heard him saying, yeah, this is the senator personally. And I want to speak to the vice president personally. So after a couple of clicks, Mondale's on the line. And George McGovern says to him, you know, I understand that OMB is recommending that the president veto Hubert's WIC program. Hubert Humphrey had just passed. He was much beloved on both sides of the aisle. And he says, I really don't think Hubert would like that. So next thing I know, the vice president calls back and says, here's the deal. Carter will sign the bill if you give your word to reduce the authorization by $50 million in the next year. He looks at me, I said, absolutely. I mean, so we're going from 250 to 750 as opposed to 250 to 8. It's just a funny story. They continued being a team. Now, in the middle of all this, as you know, Jean Maillet chaired the White House Conference on Nutrition, that first one, that set up the agenda for the next decade. I never in a million years, growing up in Connecticut and New England, expected that I would have a career that really is bookended by these 2 White House conferences on nutrition. I mean, it's not what was in my mind. I had never heard of nutrition or food programs. Of course, we hadn't created them yet. And I figured I'd be a trial attorney, which I sort of was for the first year because I was in tribal court every single day, which is another story. I won't digress. But that was the 70s. Food stamps was taken to a national program. Every single county was given food stamps. It was fundamentally reformed. This may be hard for you to believe, but the food stamp program, you used to have to pay for food stamps. In 1977, we eliminated the purchase requirement, and we had buttons that said EPR, EPR. I mean, it was the whole thing with the anti-hunger NGOs. And McGovern and Humphrey wrote a letter to then elected President Carter saying it makes no sense. So you paid how much you paid based on your income. Everybody would get the same amount, but how much you paid for it would vary. They eliminated the purchase requirement and fundamentally restructured the program. It was easier to qualify for the program, uniform deductions. School lunch was created, expanded, breakfast was created, nutrition education was created. So there was a lot going on. And even after both McGovern, who was defeated in 1980, and Dole, who resigned to run for president, they were still buddies. And in fact, we went to the White House with Bill Clinton was then president, and to convince him to start a pilot project on the global food security program, give kids all over the world essentially free lunches. That was a funny meeting because I remember George McGovern saying to me, "What do I call him, Marsh? Do I call him Mr. President or do I call him Bill?" And the reason he asked for that, I said, Bill, of course, is that Bill Clinton started as George McGovern's staff person. He ran the state of Texas for McGovern in 1972. Hillary was down there. They had not yet been married. And some of Hillary's closest friends were strongly advising her not to marry this guy. And she told that story at a funeral not too long ago. So I feel I can publicly say that. But they did that. They went to see Clinton and he agreed, and we got $300 million to start a program for global food security that now has been enacted into law. I want to mention that in 1977, so this is still under the Select Committee on Nutrition, the Senate was restructuring itself, and we knew the Select Committee, this will make your eyes water over, was going to become a subcommittee in 78. What's the difference? A select committee may have more power, but a subcommittee has legislative jurisdiction, so you can actually pass laws. The select committee could just have hearings and create a political process in support of it. But then ultimately, if you introduced a bill, food stamps, it would go to the Ag Committee. The select committee could not pass laws. So going to the subcommittee was actually a good thing. However, we had not yet spoken to the issue of nutrition, the quality of nutrition. And that concerned me. And the staff director, who's a good guy, Alan Stone, who lives up here in Cambridge. So in 1977, the Select Committee issued Dietary Goals for the United States. It was we didn't think of it as a big deal. We just looked at the dietary guidelines around the world and we took the common denominator, and we had a panel of MDs to advise these young kids who none of us were nutritionists, of course. But we were starting to catch on. We had a series of hearings with the NIH and the Cancer Institute, the Heart Institute. We were learning. The American Medical Association blasted the Select Committee for practicing medicine without a license. Nobody seemed to agree with that. And in 1980, the first edition of the USDA HHS Dietary Guidelines for Americans was issued. And it's, as you probably know, here at the school, it's been updated every 5 years since. But that's how it got started. It also led to, eventually in the year 2000, it led to the creation of nutrition labeling. I think it was 2000. 1990. Thanks, Derry. But that's what led to it. It was the dietary goals, and it was the emphasis on nutrition, and people wanted to figure out what's healthy, what's not. They still haven't figured it out. Hopefully, the FDA's new rule on what's healthy, and with the assistance of the Friedman School, they're going to figure this out and get it straight. But it was a fascinating thing. In 2008, I'm going to almost finish the history, and then I'm going to give you what I hope to make your charge. By the way, somebody has to tell me the time, because that clock has said 11:45 since I got here. 1:45. Well, I knew that it wasn't 11:45, but I want to give you all time for Q&A, because I get to reminiscing, and I want to make sure I'm talking about what you wanted me to talk about. In 2008, Obama's elected, but by coincidence, it also leads to the enactment and the creation of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA, AGRA.org. There's no reason for you ever heard of it. But the reason I mention it is because the president of AGRA was the chair of the White House, of the UN Conference on Nutrition and Hunger, just, I guess it's a full year ago now, in 21. In 2019, the Secretary General of the UN was really concerned that the number of hungry people in the world was not going down, it was going up. And that was before the pandemic and before the war in Ukraine. The numbers were going the wrong way. So he had the president of AGRA, Dr. Agnes Kalibata, who has her credentials from UMass. She got her PhD in entomology here at the University of Massachusetts. I tell her all the time, it's not as good as UConn, but it wasn't bad. She chaired that conference, and I don't think it's any coincidence that the UN goal of eliminating hunger by 2030 is exactly what Biden has adopted as his goal, as you all know. If you saw the Biden conference, if you went to the Biden conference, I did get to go. The same goal. He wants to eliminate hunger, and he wants to reduce diet-related disease, which clearly should be done. I mean, 7 of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States are related to diet. I've been saying that for only 50 years. Nobody's listed. I hope this group is different. I think it is. It blows my mind that medical schools do not require human nutrition to be taught. I don't understand that. If you become a veterinarian, you know exactly how to fatten that pig or reduce the fat content of the pig or the cow or whatever you're talking about. Human nutrition, no. Harvard Medical School, do they teach human nutrition?
Pretty good at fattening humans, actually.
That's another story. We're pretty good at fattening humans. Yes, we are. Yes, we are. And we need people to start balancing their calories with not eating more than they burn off. As recently as just a week ago or 2 weeks ago, as you know, after the White House conference, the Food Nutrition Service had a conference on the healthcare summit. I was taken in particular, but I'm going to actually read this. Biden used the same sentence at the UN General Assembly earlier in the year that he used at the White House conference on hunger. And it's just true. If parents cannot feed their children, nothing else matters. So it gets to what would be my vision for you all. You know, if I was at Friedman School now, and that's where I'd be. I went to law school. I shouldn't have. I should have gone to the Friedman School of Nutrition. There's still time. Derry tells me that they're accepting applications, so it may happen. I see 3 focuses. One, of course, is filling the gaps. I mean, The US government is not stingy on food. It's interesting. We spend $170 billion last year, the US government spent on USDA feeding programs. But obviously, we're not reaching all the people. We're not reaching them with an adequate diet. We're not reaching them with a healthy diet. And hunger is still a problem in the United States. The quality of the food is clearly a problem. I don't have a quick answer to that. The National Academy of Sciences has urged the Department of Agriculture to update the WIC standards. That has to happen. USDA is working on an updated child nutrition standard. We've got to give incentives for people on food stamps to buy the right foods, fruits, vegetables, nuts, high fiber cereals. We have not done that. It will cost money. I was looking at the numbers. I'm going to read you just a couple numbers. The numbers on food stamps during the pandemic are pretty good. I mean, the numbers have gone up slightly, because for obvious reasons. From about 35 million people are now on stamps. I still call them stamps. It's SNAP. And it's gone up to 41 million people. So 41 million people really relied on food stamps to survive the pandemic, which is sort of an extraordinary thing. WIC, the number has remained about stable, 6 million people on WIC, which would certainly warm McGovern and Hubert Humphrey's heart, and Bob Dole too. Bob Dole, like Nixon, was a more progressive guy than people ever realized. The school lunch numbers are terrible, just terrible. They were feeding kids free during the pandemic. Now they're back to requiring that they fill out free and reduced price lunch applications. It's not working. People don't know they have to do it. And we've gone from 30 million kids a day, 30 million kids, down to 5 million kids. It's a terrible situation. And I really don't like how they run that program. Right now, you've got 100,000 schools in the United States operating a school lunch program. They serve 50 million kids. Of the 50 million kids where they send home free and reduced price applications, those 30 million fill it out. So what do the school lunch people do? They are required to verify the income, document the income. So you've got nutritionists, instead of worrying about the quality of the food, they're tracking down income and doing the exact same thing the IRS does. We have got to have a better system than that. There are a couple ideas I've got in mind. I won't bore you with that. The other thing we need to do, and which is outside the United States, we are down to 1% of the population feeding the country, which is extraordinary. In Africa, the other extreme, 70, 80% of the people farm. And they're paying 70 or 80% of their income on food. If you want to solve world hunger, you have to increase the production around the world. I'm still on the board of the World Food Program. And I tell them every time we meet that we can't give away enough food. It's not possible. If every country met their goal, it still wouldn't feed all the people that are hungry. And the war in Ukraine has made it worse. We've got to increase production. We're not doing it. We being, I'm using the royal we, it's not just WFP, it's FAO, it's the governments, it's the African Union. But Africa not only is the biggest problem, it's the potential solution, because they've got the land and the water and personnel. I have brought something. This is my show tell that I've given out to everybody in Washington that I could think of that knows what they're talking about. This is actually produced for farmers in Africa. Now, we all know what agriculture looks like. Even if you didn't grow up on a farm, and I suspect a lot of you did not, you've heard about, I mean, it's a family farm in the United States, in South Dakota, it's 10,000 acres. and a tractor is 60 feet wide. And now the new tractors, you don't even need a person. It's all done by GPS. And they test the soil every single acre, so they know how much water to put into it, how much fertilizer to put into it, how to deal with it. This is where we are in technology in Africa. We hand out these ropes to smallholder farmers, always women. It's way too hard for men. They're using hose. And the farm is an acre, 2 acres. A hectare is 2 acres, 2.5 acres. This tells farmers how far apart to plant a rows of corn or whatever. The bottle caps tell farmers how far apart to put seeds. And this tells them how far apart to put the fertilizer from the seed. This is the level of technology in Africa. As a result, and many of the other undeveloped countries. It blows my mind. And as you can tell, I've been on a crusade about this. The secretary has these. The chairman of the ag committees have these. The ranking Republicans have these. I give them out widely. And in Africa, they tease me. They say, what the hell does a Washington, D.C. lawyer do with all these AGRA ropes? And I said, I give them out because people that think they understand the challenge don't understand it unless they've seen this, because it brings it home to really how much we're talking about. So in my mind, the challenge for you all, if I were starting again here at Friedman School, and I may apply, you've got threefold, depending on what your interest is. A, we need to plug the holes in the USDA nutrition programs. B, we need to improve the quality of those programs. And some of you who are dealing with international agriculture need to figure out how we increase production around the world. I've talked to the WFP executive director about this many, many times. The coordination between WFP and the Food and Ag Organization is not adequate, and I've told them that. The technology is not reaching these countries. The war in Ukraine has made things much worse. I mean, 20% of all the wheat that was shipped in the world was shipped out of Ukraine. And now, as you know from reading the paper, just this week, or was the last week, Putin reneged on this deal that would allow Ukraine to export wheat, corn oil, soybean oil, and those things that are just really basic for human consumption. There are more people that will die in Africa from hunger than from COVID. That is not acceptable. The White House Conference on Nutrition did not have the bandwidth, the time to deal with global. But it's something the president knows about and is very committed to. I've, in years gone by before he was president, had time to talk to him about this many times. And his son Hunter, who we all know by reputation anyhow, was actually chair of the World Food Program board here in the US for one term, 5 years. So the Bidens care about this. The secretary cares about this, Secretary Vilsack. The head of policy at the White House, Susan Rice, cares about this. Clearly the head of AID, it's a high priority. It's not Samantha Power's highest, it's not what makes her heart beat faster, but there are people on her staff who feel that way about it. She's into government and tyranny and genocides and good government. There are a lot of people around the world that are into this. The Tony Blair Institute, I have teased Tony Blair that he has more power now than when he was prime minister, because the Tony Blair Institute has offices in about 20 countries. 14 of them are in Africa. And his highest priority is increasing food production. He knows nothing about agriculture, but his staff has come to learn, and he knows that it's quite important. So in my mind, I see an extraordinary challenge for you all in the Friedman School. I mean, it's continuing this revolution that started here in Boston hundreds of years ago. And now we've discovered hunger in not just the United States, but in the world. And you've got to do something about it. I think that's the charge. I see food, nutrition, agriculture as an exciting vocation. It's not. It's Secretary Vilsack, Secretary. He calls it. It's sexy again. It's food production has become sexy. Nutrition has become sexy, and it has. And you all are the ones that are making it sexy. So I'm going to close on that and turn it over to Park to MC any questions that you may have. I know there are a lot of people online. I personally telecommute to the office. I haven't been to my law firm since the pandemic. I love telecommuting. It's not had a good consequence for the United States, but it's extended my career and allowed me to telecommute. So I know that a lot of the students here are also listening online. Park, how do you?
Thanks for that wonderful presentation. And we've got plenty of time for questions. And what we'll do is we'll take the first couple here in the room, but we'll also have help monitoring the chat and in fact, I will help monitor the chat with Chantal's advice here. And wait just a second after raising your hands, and we'll get a mic to you. And Eileen first would be great.
Terrific summary of the history, Marshall, which I'm not sure is written anywhere. But anyway, you have been extraordinarily successful in positive changes in food nutrition over decades. But the environment's changed. I mean, a lot of what you were able to accomplish had a bipartisan focus. It's a very divisive environment at the moment in Washington, and seen in the discussions of the new Ag Bill, Farm Bill, and SNAP, what you're trying to accomplish at school lunch. How do you have to modify your strategy to get something done?
You do have to modify your strategy. I played to the Republicans. I just figure the Democrats will be there. You've got to come up with a plan that works for the Republicans. I think on diet and health, they actually agree. I mean, Republicans like kids, Democrats like kids. They all want kids. Okay, they have kids. I think it's one of the few issues that has the potential to unite a very divisive Congress. It still is. I believe in that. I had extraordinary opportunity. I mean, when we were counsel, I was counsel to the Nutrition Committee and the Ag Committee. You simply worked for whichever senator had an interest in your issues without regard to party. We sat together, the majority staff, minority staff, we all shared offices. Now you have to play it different. I don't think a universal free school lunch program can pass. I believe in it. I would vote for it in a heartbeat, but it would cost $10 or $12 billion a year. What I've been circulating to them, without any success, by the way, is an idea of having the IRS collect the money, and they already have your income. They have your income. They know how many kids you have. You got to allow parents to opt out if they want to because their child is sick or they're only kosher meals or whatever. They simply hate school lunch. They have to be able to opt out. But I think it's got to be done in a creative, different way. And I think the White House conference they want bold new ideas, but I don't see them yet. The Congress, the Ag committees don't talk to the finance committees, which they would have to do to pass this because it's a tax bill. The Department of Treasury, which has the IRS, doesn't really coordinate with USDA. I mean, it would be a radical change, but the president says he wants bold ideas. So I forwarded this and I've gotten this deafening silence. But you just can't give up, Eileen. I mean, you just can't. There are, one of the leaders on nutrition is right here in Massachusetts, Jim McGovern, who is no relationship to George McGovern. He always says that. His father owns a liquor store in Worcester. But he did start his career working for George as an intern. And he has found some Republicans to work with. It's harder, but I think it's possible. And I don't think we can give up. I mean, you just can't. I mean, there's too much hunger in the world. You just can't. And too much hunger here in the United States. I think hunger around the world is defined differently than here. Here, nutritionally insecure. There, you're talking about actually starving to death. It's a different definition. The Horn of Africa. I mean, it's people are dying. I mean, it's a terrible, sad situation. But
so your answer addressed the interpersonal parts of what blocks progress today. But I wondered if you wanted to comment briefly on sort of the end of some of the traditions of horse trading and earmarks. That also, that always had strengths and weaknesses. There was always something unsavory about it. But I think also we might be, to some extent, feeling the loss.
I think that's right. I mean, the Congress, in addition to being less partisan, more partisan, has changed the process. When we got funding for the Tufts School of Nutrition, the Friedman School, it was an earmark, which meant that Tip O'Neill, who was then Speaker of the House of Representatives, happened to represent across the river. And he took it upon himself. And Jean Maillet was a very powerful advocate. How could you not love Jean Maillet? He's this little French guy, and he spoke with this very clear French accent. And you loved him. So Tip O'Neill supported that funding. It came over to the Senate, and they wanted George McGovern's blessing because he chaired the nutrition subcommittee. So he played a very, very small role on that. But that was one of the advantages of earmarks, which now are not allowed.
Yesterday, we walked by the HNRCA, which was funded by that piece of history that you just heard about.
Yeah.
We should take a question from Irv.
Irv?
And Chantal's bringing a...
Good to see you.
Good to see you, Marshall. And thank you so much for that review and for all the things you've done. You've been a great hero of mine for these many years. And sometimes we've even been shoulder to shoulder. I was the dean here when we made the name the Friedman School of Nutrition, Science, and Policy. And I just wanted your comment on the question of how can we do our best at making the connection possible of science and policy for those of you who have had such a strong record in Congress and the Senate Select Committee. One example of that is, could we be doing a better job of defining what we mean by hunger, so that we can make the strongest case for whether we're making progress or not toward zero hunger or less hunger? Are we in the scientific community doing as much as we might do to provide the ammunition for those who are leading the political discourse?
The answer to your question in a word is no. The scientific community is not where it should be. We don't have a uniform definition on hunger. We don't have a uniform definition on what's healthy. And that becomes a very political situation. I went through that when we wrote the Dietary Goals. It was brutal. I mean, it was a political war. I didn't know about it. I was in it naively, and just, and we had a panel of very respected doctors who were helping us. Mark Hegstead from Harvard was helping us, and Phil Lee from was an MD out in California who later became the Assistant Secretary for Health. But the answer is no. It's a very political definition. And not just is hunger not defined, but healthy is not defined. Now, maybe the new FDA rule will get comments that do that. The National Academy of Sciences has recommended 5 years ago, they wrote to the Secretary of Ag saying, please update the WIC regulations to be consistent with whole grain rich. WIC is interesting. WIC is called a Special Supplemental Food Program. It's not food stamps. It's meant to be targeted based on good nutrition. They need to update that. They need to update, it says that you should have more yogurt, but it doesn't, it takes a pass on requiring the yogurt to have vitamin D, which is because it replaces milk. It should have vitamin D. As Chris and I talked about last night. The answer is no. And here's where the politics gets into it. It's very complicated. Going through my mind, this has no analogy, but I remember they tried to figure out which military bases to close. And it got so political, they had to set up a commission, an independent commission to figure out which military bases to close. It's the same thing here. The politics of nutrition is fierce because you're talking about billions of dollars. If you shift 2% of your calories from carbs to protein, that has a major market impact. Some people like it, some people don't, but they all have lobbyists in Washington. And that makes it complicated. But the answer is yes, the scientific community needs to be more united. I don't know who organizes that. I've talked to the president of, I know you're a private university, but I've talked to APLU, the Association of Public Land Grant Universities, which represents UConn and UMass and Cornell and lots of schools all across the country. They have not taken this up. How do you put science more into these disciplines? I think that dairy is going to help us with that, but that's part of the challenge. And it's a very complicated challenge. It's not simple. But yes, the scientific community needs to be more united. They could start by teaching human nutrition in medical schools.
Next question. Yes, Eileen.
I just was prompted by this is a major issue for me, Marshall, and you know this. People have to be willing to let themselves out there. And you talked about Bob Dole. We have him actually on tape. We did Heroes in Nutrition. He's one of them. And he said on tape that my position on food stamps in Kansas never got me a single vote, but it was the right thing to do. And you just need to have more of that. At the reception before the recent White House conference, one of the staffers who I knew said, because I asked him this question, and he said, well, there is what members, meaning congressmen, senators, there is what members should do, and there's what they do to get reelected. And that's a very sad commentary. So it's not, from a scientific point of view, I think people, researchers have to not only do the good science, but they have to look at ways of having impact with their science.
I guess there's a question there, but I just totally agree with you. But it gets complicated. George McGovern and Bob Dole represented big Midwestern states, those square states that everybody flies over. But what do they grow? They grow corn, they grow cattle. It's a very complicated political challenge. I think the more science you put into it, the better it is for the United States. And the more the scientific community, the National Academy of Sciences, whoever is the leader in this, the White House Conference on Nutrition, the more clear the recommendations are, the better. Because the Nixon conference was very specific. It led to food stamps and it led to WIC. I've heard, I'm saying this, I probably shouldn't, because I'm a big Biden supporter, but I've heard from the left, people that I'm at the age group where some of my friends were actually at the 69 conference. I was not, but it was, the charge was more specific. It wasn't just parents being very upset if their kids are hungry. So I think as specific as the report can be, the better. It'll give the policymakers in Congress and in the administration and whoever the next administration is, it won't all happen immediately. It took 10 years for the Nixon conference to be successful. People compare the two conferences. I think that's very unfair because it took 10 years of congressional action to make the Nixon conference successful. And the irony of it is the guy who made it the most successful was the guy he defeated for president in 72. But so be it. I mean, it's part of the ironies of Washington. I know you're students in nutrition, not political science, but.
So with that forward-looking charge, reflecting both on the original White House conference and on this special time that we live in during the post period from the recent White House conference this fall, let's give a warm thank you to Marshall Matz.
I want to thank you for the invitation. I clearly enjoy being back in Boston. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great lunch.
Chris.